don't know if you noticed or not, Jim regularly in his prayers will mention our theme for the year of Stronger Together, and I appreciate him doing that and reminding us of that and praying for God to help us in achieving that goal of continuing to recognize that we are, as God's people, stronger together with God and stronger together when we work together with one another in the kingdom. And so I really appreciate that. Appreciate other aspects of his prayer too, but I appreciate very much his thoughtfulness in doing that in our prayers together. We were talking on Wednesday night about the vanity of work, and specifically we were talking as we ended class about that work as a focus for the meaning of our lives. Work is a vanity because ultimately we can work all we want to and accomplish all that we want to, and we still die. And when we die, we leave all that we've worked for behind. All that we've accomplished is left behind. And sometimes it's left behind for people that don't respect it, don't care for it, and don't utilize it in the right kinds of ways. And so he talks about that aspect of work life being vanity of vanities, all is vanity, and like striving after the wind. Then in verse 23, he makes the statement, "For all his days are full of sorrow, and his work is a vexation. Even in the night his heart does not rest. This also is vanity." And so my question was, in 2a, is verse 23 making the same point as what was being made in 18 through 22? And you can probably guess that by me asking the question, I don't believe he is. And I mean, even in just reading it, at least in the English Standard Version, it says, "This also is vanity," which leads, I mean, just the nature of language itself says, I've been talking about a vanity that is a part of work as the focus of our meaning of life in 18 through 22, but this also is vanity. And so it seems like an additional point. So my question is, how is what he says in verse 23, "For all his days are full of sorrow and his work is a vexation, even in the night his heart does not rest," how is that different from what he said in 18 through 22? If it is. You may not think it is, and that's okay. But if you do, then let's talk a little bit about how that is the case. Why is that different? What might be the point being made here? Yes, sir.
And if I was trying to see a difference between the two, I guess the first one I see is the time, because in 18 through 22, it's when I'm gone, all of my labors they go to someone else. But at 23, it seems as though he's saying, even in the midst of, during my lifetime, the cost of all this hard work it's taking a toll on me and doesn't seem to be worth it.
Okay, and that's, I would agree with you. And how is that true? How is it true not only that all of that work can ultimately be for naught when I'm gone, but that even while the focus of my life now is work, it is a vexation and vanity and what is it he says? I guess even in the night his heart does not rest. So how is that true? And I want you to think about it. I think maybe it's a little difficult for us to understand the point, because I think for most of us, work is not the focus of our lives. I said I've told the last several people that I've interviewed with that I want to be clear up front that I work to live, I don't live to work. And there are people who live to work. They live for the purpose of working and accomplishing things in their work life. And you can tell that by the way that they live. I mean, they work in some ways 24/7, 365. They just never stop. They work while they're at work. They take their work home with them. They work wherever they are. I mean, it's whether it's on the phone, on the computer, just in their mind, they're constantly concerned about the things that are going on at work. And that is evident in their life, the way they talk, the things they focus on. And so I think for us it might be a little difficult, because if you're like me and you work to live, not live to work, then you're like, well, I mean, I find enjoyment in my work, and then I go home and I leave that behind me, and I do the things that I do at home. Yes, sir. Greg.
I think I was given a copy of a book called Strength to Strength, and it really, I think, goes into this topic of how life's labors can become very disappointing. I think, if you don't, even if you don't make it your life's work, the authors of this book I'm referencing, his point was that the things that you're good at when you're younger, you're not necessarily good at when you're older. And so if you start life as a young, active person who works with their hands, works with a strong body and a strong back, that you'll find that you've got to figure out something else to do, because that back won't be as strong when you're older, your hands won't be as nimble. And there's always someone who's coming up that's better at what you do than you are. And I think in terms of the vanity of it, for those individuals who make life their lives, make work their life's work, the sense of emptiness and the sense of lack of accomplishment as you see people are just passing me up. I cannot, this young generation has beaten me at my own game.
Right.
And so that's when people, according to the author, need to step back, evaluate what's important to them, and make changes in how they maybe even careers, maybe not, but the whole point of it is you're not going to win the game of work, because there's always going to be someone that's going to work harder and better and smarter and faster than you.
Right.
You'll never win that game. And that's a real sense of achievement and accomplishment that shouldn't be disregarded, but it shouldn't be the focus of your life.
Yes, I mean, you're right. All the things that you were mentioning were things that can make life a vexation, or work a vexation, and our toil and striving feel like vanity. And they're things that we have to. They're all things I think that every one of us have to grapple with in different ways. Even if work is not the focus of our life, it is a part of it, and sometimes, I mean, it's a pretty big part of it. And there are things we like to accomplish. Yes, sir, John.
Verse 23 might even be more simple than that, where he says that in the daytime you're burdened with your labor,
Yes.
but you can't even sleep at night. You can't leave it behind.
Right.
You can't compartmentalize it and forget it and get a good night's rest.
Yes, and I mean, I do think that's an aspect of what he's talking about in that verse, is that, I mean, it weighs on us. It weighs on us in the day. And I mean, if you think about it, and maybe I'm saying more about myself than necessarily everybody else, but typically when we set our mind to a task, what do we eventually hope to do? We hope to complete it. But the problem with, I mean, every place I've ever been a part of in work is when you complete one task, what are there? There are two more. Or, I mean, is the work ever really done? I mean, at work. I mean, yeah, at home, we can set out to clean the house or to do our spring cleaning or whatever it is, and eventually we can accomplish all the things we've got on the list, right? And then we get to rest for a few months and not have to worry about it unless, something. I've said, I think everybody talks about homes being a great investment. I understand why. But the reality is I've always seen a home as a big hole for time and money. Because unless you have a brand new house that is exactly the way you want it, with likely nothing that can go wrong, and if it does, it's under warranty and somebody else is going to cover it, there is always something that arises inside a house that's going to need to be addressed and taken care of. And so work's the same way. We have things at work that need to be accomplished. We accomplish the task and we feel fulfilled and everything's great, only to realize there are 6 more tasks that still have to be accomplished, and so we have to go to that. And whether it's in the day, or if you can't compartmentalize, as John was saying, your work life with your personal life, then even at night, what do you lie awake sometimes doing? And the reality is, I think all of us have done this. Hopefully, maybe I'm just telling on myself. I think we've all done this to some extent. We wake up in the middle of the night and we think about the next day and what we've got to accomplish, and we're racking our brains trying to figure out how am I going to get that done and what's the best way for me to attack it. Well, the person whose focus of their life is work does that all the time. I mean, 24/7, 365, their brain's thinking about how is it that I can accomplish all these tasks that need to get done at work. and the reality is, even if they figured out how to accomplish all those tasks, we already realize there are going to be more. The work is never done. Sometimes I say that about stay-at-home moms. Stay-at-home moms are full-time all the time. I mean, there's no end to the work of being a mother. That's just the reality. And for people who have looked at that and thought, wow, it must be nice to get to stay home and do nothing. People who say that, I knew of a man once who said, his thought was, and he actually said this in front of a bunch of women. I thought, you're lucky to still be alive. He was talking to a bunch of stay-at-home moms, and he said, well, I don't know why you're so stressed. You sit at home all day and eat chocolate and watch the washing machine go around. And I'm like, I mean, if you really believe that, maybe you should stay home a day and try it. Because if you've ever tried it, you would have a great deal more respect for what those ladies are doing. I've said before, I've done a lot of hard things. Doing that is the hardest job on the planet. And if you don't believe me, then do it. Try a week. I dare you. You'll be begging to give it up because it's hard. And now, fulfilling, yes. Great deal of joy, yes. But it's a hard job. It's a hard work, and a necessary one. And so, anyway, I think John may have hit the nail on the head with his thoughts, and that's kind of my main thinking too. Was the idea is if your life is all about work, you can never set it down, and it's always weighing on you. I mean, that's what I think about when I think of vexation. It's just this horrible, heavy weight that's always there. And even at night, he says, there is no rest. You can't turn it off, and you can't stop, and there's no end to it. And so this also is a great vanity. And he's not saying don't work because it's all horrible. I mean, that's not his point. In fact, he goes on in the next verse to say, verse 24, there is nothing better for a person than that he should eat, drink, and find enjoyment in his toil. And I want to talk about that a little bit because I think it's Paul that quotes from some of the philosophers of the day, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And we've all heard that quote before. And that idea, and the idea behind the quote of the philosophers is what? What are they basically saying? I mean, is God really at the focal point of that? No, he is here. And that's the difference, and I think it's important for us to see it. But in the philosophers, when they say eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, what is their idea?
All about living right now.
Yeah, just indulge the flesh in whatever way you want to. Enjoy every moment, no matter what it costs. No matter what it costs you, no matter what it costs anybody else. Just enjoy the moment. Take pleasure in everything that you see before you and in everything that you can experience, because tomorrow you're going to be dead. That's their idea. What is Solomon's point? Eat, drink, and enjoy, and find enjoyment in his toil. And again, we have to really understand that in the grand context of the book itself, not just in this idea of life under the sun, because that's, there's a sense in which the things that he's talking about are a part of life under the sun. But there's a little bit of a disclaimer here. the lawyers would have some really fine print and make sure we couldn't read it. But what's his real point? I mean, I think he even says it, he does say it in this verse. And he says it over and over again throughout the book, and it's important for us to note it. Jim.
Yeah, that word transitory. I counted 36 times he used out these 12 chapters. And you was talking about the house a while ago. I was thinking, you can tell a man whether or not he owns a house because he usually comes out of the hardware store or the lumber company.
Yeah, and if he's like me, he comes out of that store 6 times for one project, because he goes the first time and he gets the 3/4 inch plumbing when he needs a 1/2 inch, and then he's got to go back and get a
3/8 and a half. That's
and then he's got to go back and get a reducer. No, I was not talking about your project, by the way. And then he goes back and has to get a reducer because he's got 3/4 and 1/2. So I mean, it's 6 times to Lowe's or Menards for one particular job. Yes, sir.
Well, if we look at the perfect Garden of Eden, when God puts Adam in the garden, the first thing he assigns him to do is to tend it and keep it.
Yes.
So the first blessing he gives him is labor.
Yes.
And that's what he's saying here, is that comes from the hand of God.
Yeah. I mean, work, although part of the curse was that you're gonna work in the sweat of your brow. So it was going to be harder work. It was going to be made more difficult because of sin. But John's right. Work was a part of the first mandate God gave to people. Well, why did he do that? That sounds like that's just not a gift at all. It's horrible. Why did he give him? Why would he give man a mandate that required him to work? Huh? Well, before the sin added difficulty to the labor, John's right. There was already work. He was to tend and keep the garden. That involves labor. Why would he do that? That sounds like a punishment to begin with. Yes, ma'am.
Maybe it was to teach him that not to expect anything for nothing.
Okay, there's
With us,
okay,
we
there's
don't put some effort or some cause into what we do.
there certainly is benefit from that, and I mean that is one of the benefits, and that's really my point is, and I said what I said. I mean, when your kids were growing up, did they ever say that? Oh, why do I have to do that? Why do I have to do this? Right? And then we as adults do the same thing, don't we? Oh, I can't believe I have to do that. But what is the reality about work? Hard work sometimes even.
Purpose.
It has purpose. And what does it develop? I remember Dawn. Her parents raised them on a small farm. They had a 5-acre pepper plant, green peppers that they had to deal with every year. Her father raised them because they could sell those peppers at market and make a little additional money for their family. And so I remember her saying to me multiple times, oh, I used to hate when I was growing up because our parents would make us, when we came home from school, every day go out into the pepper patch and weed the peppers. She said, I hated that so much. It was so awful. And I looked at her and I said, are you listening to yourself? I said, yeah, you didn't like it as a kid. But I mean, she was one of the hardest working people I've met. And how do you think she got that mentality? Just happened by accident? She just happened to be blessed with it, right? No, part of it was because she had to go out and, to her chagrin, weed a pepper patch every summer in order to help her family have a little additional cash. And so it was the hard work ethic that her parents instilled in her that became a part of who she was and what she did. And so work has benefit. And we recognize that on a much smaller level than a 5-acre pepper patch with the things that we have our children do when they're growing up, that there is benefit to be had by sticking to a schedule and accomplishing tasks and doing sometimes hard work. And so we try to instill those principles in them. And then sometimes we forget some of those principles ourselves. But God knew, and I mean, this is the reality. And I think about the passage in Deuteronomy, I think it's is it Deuteronomy 8:28 or thereabouts? Maybe it's 6:28. I can't remember. It may not even be 28 at all. But where he says, to remember the Lord's commandments, which are for our good always. I mean, I think we look at some of the things God says and we think, well, he was just trying to make life hard. And that's what Satan wants us to think. I mean, that was the point he made to Eve. Well, you know, that food's not really bad for you, and it's not really going to hurt you. God's just trying to hold you back. He doesn't want you to be like him. And so Satan wants us to believe that God's just trying to make life difficult. But the reality is, no matter what it is, whether it's work or any of those things that God gives us as tasks, are they not always fun? Are they not always enjoyable in and of themselves? Do they require hard effort that we sometimes don't feel like giving? Yes. But the reality is that God knows they are beneficial for us. And so from the very beginning, he gave man a task to tend and keep the garden because he knew work is not bad. Now, work for the sake of work or work as the meaning of life, Solomon is saying, is vanity. It's like striving after wind, and it's ultimately going to be without purpose because you're going to die, and because you haven't focused your life in the right place, you're going to leave all that behind, and you're still going to be gone, and now you're going to have to give an account for your soul. And so ultimately that is a big waste. That's futility. But work, when we recognize the gift that it is from God, which is what he says here, and eating and drinking and pleasure and all those things that we have to enjoy, later the wife of your youth, all of these blessings are blessings God gives for our benefit to develop us to be the people he wants us to be. And so when we can look at work in that way as a God-given task that helps us to accomplish some things here and ultimately is good for society too, in the gifts that we're able to provide as we accomplish the tasks that we have, everything works together for good, but it's good for us and it develops us to be the people God wants us to be. For that we can give thanks and find enjoyment and accomplishment and be thankful to God for it. Yes, sir, Andrew.
I think there was another way I was looking at this verse that's maybe a different angle to it, which is kind of, I wonder if he's talking about the idea of having enough and realizing when you have enough. It's interesting to me that so often in the Bible when we hear about the providence of God and the blessings of God, it's food, drink, clothing, maybe a shelter.
Right.
You know, it's are your needs satisfied? That's a blessing from God.
Right.
And so when he says there's nothing better than to eat and drink and find enjoyment in your work, you know, eat and drink, sometimes we think of like, sometimes that phrase conjures up ideas of like pleasure or
Right.
something like that. But it could just be, are you fed and clothed? Like if you have enough, then why are you pursuing more? And that's, I think, kind of foreign to us and foreign to our standard of living that we're used to.
Definitely.
So when we start talking about your real needs, we get kind of nervous because it starts highlighting to us, well, what do I really need? And how much do I really need?
Right.
And I think if we're able to live, I wrote live net zero is what I put in quotes. You know, once your needs are met, you know, why hoard up the rest? And why always pursue more to layer on top?
Right.
When, you know, you have to ask yourself, is that really necessary?
Yeah, I mean, Andrew's right. It definitely challenges our American way of thinking. But the reality is the Bible has a great deal to say about being content with what you have. And it also does emphasize frequently, I mean, even Matthew 6 that we quote a lot, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, all these things will be added to you. I mean, the focus of the context is what? Food, drink, clothing, right? So it's the necessities, the needs that we have, and Andrew's right. The things that we need are relatively small. I mean, there aren't a great deal of things that we need. You got to follow up.
I think if we're able to see, you know, God's providence and blessing is giving us what we acknowledge that, then if we realize we have more than what we need, well, then it's all the better to see that as being additional blessing from God.
Yeah.
Whereas if we're thinking, well, I just need to make more money, or I just need to work harder and do better for myself, there's really no point where it's very hard to say when you have enough, if
Right.
that's your mentality. Where do you stop? Whereas if you realize God has given me what I need, He's given me even more beyond what I need, why do I need to always accumulate more?
Yeah, everything else is a kind of an added bonus, and just trying to seek after more and more is a vexation and futility. Yes, sir.
Seems to me that in chapter 5, verse 18, he says, here's what I've seen to be good and fitting to eat, drink, and enjoy oneself in all one's labor, in which he dwells under the sun during the few years of his life, which God has given him for this is his reward. Furthermore, as for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, he has also empowered him to eat from them and to receive his reward and rejoice in his labor. This is the gift of God, for he will not often consider the years of his life, because God keeps him occupied with gladness in his heart. So that's the positive thing that occurs, that God grants you. It's not a vortex that you're getting pulled down into to make things work.
Well, that's a good point. The passage Jim just read has the added benefit of the fact that not only does God give us the opportunity and the ability to enjoy what it is that He's blessed us with, but that also brings a peace of mind that keeps us from being overly concerned with and worrying all the time about where things are going to come from in the days ahead. And there's some sense in which that can even be a great blessing for people when they lose their job, because I've not really had that experience to where I've been unemployed for long periods of time and wondered how we were going to make ends meet and all that kind of stuff. But I do know of people who've been there, and it can become a very stressful time as it weighs on you. But the reality is, when we recognize all of these blessings as things from the hand of God, is God going to allow us to ultimately be without that which we need as people of God? I mean, the psalmist says, and Proverbs says, and lots of other passages say, I mean, do we as people of God ever really have to worry about our needs being provided? Now, does that mean we should just sit back, relax, and enjoy life and watch God fill up the storehouse? Don't do anything? No. But we can do what we can and trust that God's going to provide, right? And so there is a peace of mind that comes from that can be very helpful at times when it becomes difficult for us to see how are these things how's this going to get done? How is this going to get accomplished? How are we going to live? And the reality is God's going to take care of us one way or the other. And there are a whole host of ways we could fill in that happens, but God takes care of His people. And so the key, again, Jesus says, seek first His kingdom and His righteousness. Put that first, strive for that, and then do what you can in all these other areas that are necessary, and God ultimately will see you through the struggles, the toils, the difficulties, and those times of drought and famine can provide great blessings and strength of faith and trust as well. Jim Pettigo had something a long time ago.
Yeah, I was thinking about an able-bodied man or woman that will not work. I look at them like Paul did in 1 Corinthians 13. A man without love, he's a useless nobody.
Yeah, well, and I mean, of course, with brethren in 2 Thessalonians 3, there's some points that are made with regard to the person who won't work, and Paul even comes to the conclusion, makes a statement, neither shall he eat. And I mean, his point there is not the idea of, we shouldn't provide for our own and take care of their needs, but I mean, the point is, as God's people, we have to recognize the fact that we have to labor. I mean, we have to labor with our hands and do what we can to provide for our family. Joy had something as well, and then Samantha.
I was just going to say, along with what John said about purpose, is what's our focus? What's our priority?
Right.
So if we're going to be thinking about this life, our priorities are off.
Right.
It's not that they're not important.
Right.
They're not the most important thing.
Right, and that's the challenge, is that we do live here, and there are cares of life that are necessary and not sinful in and of themselves. I mean, providing for your family, taking care of and raising children, those are cares of this life that are a part of life under the sun, and necessary cares. But ultimately, the key is keeping the true priority first. And I think I've kind of revamped the way that I've drawn the priority list in my mind, because I think before it was the idea of God and the things of God first, and then everything else kind of lined beneath it, when the reality is that it's God first in my family, it's God first in my work life, it's God first in, every aspect of life. So the reality is, God finds His way not just at the top of the list, as though we're going to do that first and then everything else comes second. It's going to be that God finds His way in every single one of those other priorities that I have in life. He's going to come first in that, because if I do that, if that's my mindset and mentality, here's the point. With the first one, God's first. So I study my Bible every day. And I give every first day of the week. And I assemble every time the church doors are open. I've put first things first. God's first in my life. But then the other 5 days a week when we're not gathered together, I read my Bible a half hour, and I spend some time in prayer. But the rest of that day, that day doesn't belong to God. That's my day. I work that day, and Saturdays are all my day because, I just do whatever I want to. And so that's the idea of having God at the top of the list. The idea of having God as first in every one of those is those other things that we've talked about still happen. But when I go to work at my job, God is still first while I'm there. And so I do everything that I do to the best of my ability, as though I'm doing it to God, as though I'm doing it to the Lord. Whether I'm serving customers or I'm serving my employer or whatever the task is that I'm seeking to accomplish, God is first in every aspect of what I do in that place. When I go home and I spend time with my family, God is first in how I treat my wife. God is first in how I'm seeking to raise my children. And so He is a part of every aspect of that, and therefore is infiltrating and shaping and molding every aspect of my life. Now, I say all that to say such things is really easy. It's not difficult to understand that that's what God wants. He wants all of me, all the time. No part of me left out. That's what God wants. It's really easy to say that and acknowledge it and say it, in Bible class and preach it from the pulpit. The difficult part, and the part that I struggle with, just like everybody else struggles with, is putting that into practice every day. And I'll tell you, I fall short just as much as anybody, or more than a host of you, in my day-to-day life, because I don't always do that. I don't always keep that focus the way that I should. But that's the key. That's what we're aiming for. That ultimately is what God wants. And here's the other aspect of what we talked about earlier in class. Ultimately, that is what is best for me. Mentally, physically, spiritually, every aspect of who I am, all of my person is better off when I have God first in everything. It is not only brings glory to God, it is good for Brace, and provides me with the blessings that God wants to provide me with. Not only the ones He is willing to pour out when I serve Him and when I put Him first, but the ones that are just inherently built into the way that He created me and created the world that He has made as well. those blessings come when we do things God's way. Samantha, you had something an hour ago.
You actually took it.
Oh,
You're
sorry.
good. You're okay.
That's what happens when I talk too much. I just rattle on, and finally I might make a point. So, anything else about chapter 2? I think I'm not going to say we've worn it out. There's still probably lots of stuff in there we haven't dealt with. But, in order to make myself feel good, the last 5 minutes we're going to talk about lesson 3. Because then I could say, hey, look, it says April 14th, and it's April 14th. We started lesson 3. You see how that works when you teach? Anything else about chapter 2, really? Okay, chapter 3. Famous verses, right? I mean, people have used this in funerals. Who was it? Was it John Lennon wrote a song? Pete Seeger. Pete Seeger. Okay, so I knew the song. I couldn't remember who it was that wrote it. The Birds performed it. So, using the language of these verses, what is the point in this? I know there are some simple surface lessons on it, and maybe some deeper meaning here as well. I mean, obviously, we read verse 2. There's a time to be born and a time to die. I mean, that's pretty straightforward, right? I mean, every one of us who are sitting here breathing air, what happened to us already? We were born. And what's going to happen to every one of us? We're going to die. I mean, the old saying I've heard since I was a kid was 2 appointments you can't avoid, death and taxes, right? That's just the way it is. That's the way life is that we're all going to die. So there is a time to be born, and there is a time to die. Is it saying what some people have done with this, that there is an appointed time, when your time's come, your time has come? I mean, do you think that's what he's talking about?
I think he's saying that there's a time for, basically what I think it's maybe saying in verse 1, there's a time for, a time and season for everything.
Yeah.
That's the point of this whole section.
Yeah, the point is just, we were all born and we are all going to die. I don't buy into that. Now, from the perspective of, does God know when I'm going to die? Of course he does. He knows everything. He knows when I'm going to die. But people will use that idea of, well, when it's your time, it's your time. From the perspective of just, I think it is designed to be a comforting explanation for why somebody dies at the time that they die. And the reality is, as we've talked about before, there are a lot of things that we say when people are grieving that there may be some truth to them, but they're not helpful. That's one of them that's not helpful. And so we really just need to be careful with the things that we say. And the reality is, as we've talked about before, if you don't know what to say, sometimes you could just not say anything. We talked about Job's friends. The only time they were any help was the first 7 days when they sat there with him and said nothing. Then they opened their mouth and it all went to pot. So, that's just the way it is. But, sometimes all we need to do is be there for people and let them know that we care. We don't have to have the right words, because the reality is there are no perfect words that are going to make it go away. You can't fix this. And it's not your job to fix it. It's just your job to be there. And so there is a time for every season. There's a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. That's reality, right? Time to sow, time to harvest. So this all seems very straightforward. It's all kind of like, no kidding, duh, right? So that's one way of looking at this. What is perhaps the real point behind it?
Well, what I'm thinking of is that, we're not in control of all of that.
Okay, there is an aspect of it. We don't have any control over it, right? Well, okay. I'm going to disagree with Samantha on some level. I can't control when I'm born, and I don't have complete control over when I die, although there are things that I could do that would speed the process up, right? If I go out and play in heavy traffic on 31, the likelihood is increased that I might die sooner than later. So there are aspects of that. But what about sowing seed in the field? Can I control that? And I can control when I pluck it out, right? I mean, to some extent, I can control when I when I harvest it. So there is some control in that aspect. I'm not disagreeing with Samantha, and she knows that. Go ahead.
I see it as balance and discretion.
Okay, so perhaps that aspect is there. Think about it a little more, and we'll talk about that beginning. See, we just began lesson 3, so I really can't pat myself on the back too much. We'll talk about this a little more on Wednesday night to start our class. I do think there's a little deeper meaning here than just the no kidding aspect of there's a time to be born and a time to die. There's a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted. I think there's a little more to it than just that. I do think the aspect Ashley's talking about is, and what Samantha said, is one aspect. There are certainly things that we don't have any control over, and we've talked about that before. He probably has that somewhat in mind here, and we'll certainly have it in mind again later in the book. But I think there are also some other things we can learn from it. And perhaps, again, the focus of what the book is really all about. We'll talk about that beginning on Wednesday night, and then we'll see how far we can get in chapter 3 Wednesday before we start, Lord willing, chapter 4 next Sunday. Thanks for your help, and look forward to Wednesday night's class.